وقل رب زدني علما.
اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما نافعا وعملا صالحا متقبلا وزدنا من فضلك حكمة وتعليما خالصا لوجهك موفقا. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. So just an overview of today's lesson. So if you haven't already joined the Telegram group, please contact the administrator or siblings of ilm, inshallah, and ask them about joining the group. We're going to cover 3 more dispensations or darurat in poetry, in verse. We're going to cover some common errors when composing verse, talk about the types of poems, the types of rajas, how to do tasria, and then the chart of Arabic poetic meters. And inshallah, once we're done this class, you basically know aroud, and that's all there is to it, inshallah. And then we will cover qafiyah or rhyme in the upcoming class, inshallah. So first of all, let's go through 3 more dispensations. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى قال المصنف غفر الله له ولوالديه ولجميع المسلمين آمين. ولك إسكان عين مع وميم لما. So in poetry, you are permitted to put a sukoon on the ayn of ma and the meme of lima. So you can just say lim in the middle of a verse. In general, you cannot insert sukoons. You cannot force a sukoon wherever you want. These are well-known exceptions. وَلَكَ إِظْهَارُ حَرَكَةِ الْإِعْرَابِ فِي الْمَنْقُوصِ الْمُعَرَّفِ رَفْعًا وَجَرًّا. Okay, so if you remember, there's something called an ism manqus. The ism manqus is an ism that ends in a ya. And normally, it does not, if it has an alif lam in front of it, you do not express the dhamma or the kasra for its i'rab. So normally, in prose, you would say جاء القاضي ومررت بالقاضي. And you would always, and in prose, you would say رأيت القاضية. So only the fatha on an ism manqus that is mu'arraf that is definite, that has an alif lam on it, normally only the fatha is exposed or is explicit when doing i'rab. In poetry, you are permitted to say, if you so please, جاء القاضي ومررت بالقاضي. So those are two permissible exceptions in poetry. Moving forward. So what were some common errors when composing verse? Some of the common errors. First of all, poetry has to actually be Arabic. Arabic poetry has to actually be Arabic. So the spelling, the usage, the grammar, the morphology, all of that has to agree with proper Arabic. And so it's before you, for example, decide to use a word, you need to make sure how it's used, how it's spelled in a serious dictionary, such as Lisan al-Arab. There is a website called bahith.info, which has that freely available, Lisan al-Arab, as well as many other dictionaries. Another common error was that many of the students did ishba' of the aroud, which is the last foot of the first hemistick. So they would do ishba' of the aroud even when there was no tasria. And so you cannot do that. You can only do ishba' of that haraka if there's tasria, and we'll go into detail about tasria today, inshallah. And another common error was doing tasria on every verse. Tasria is optional in the first verse. And that's it. Moving forward. قال المصنف النظم إما شعر وإما رجز. So verse or poetry is either شعر or it's رجز. فالقصيدة ما كان أبياتها شعرا. A qasida refers to Sher. والأرجوزة. Are there any technical difficulties? Perhaps someone turned on their speaker by accident, or their mic, rather. وَالْأُرْجُوزَةُ مَا كَانَ أَبْيَاتُهَا رَجَزًا. So what we call a poem depends on what kind of poetry it is. If it's Sher, then it's called a qasida. And if it's rajaz, then it's called an urjuza. وتغرف جميع أبيات المنظومة من شاطئ واحد من نفس البحر إلا في الرجز المزدوج. Okay, so we're going to switch over soon to the chart, to the poetic meter chart. And the point here is that the chart consists of many different individual lines, and those individual lines, as a kind of a pun, I've named Shati, a shore or a beach, because each meter is called a bahr or a sea. So I've called each one of those a Shati. So Shati is not a common term. So anytime that you want to write a number of verses, they all have to be from that same Shati, from that same variation of that one bahr, except for Rajaz Muzdawaj, which is dual Rajaz, and we'll talk about that inshallah later in this class. So switching over to the chart. So we see here, if you look at this, you see that the chart lists the bahr, and then the shati, and then the sadr and its form, then the ajuz and its form, and then an example of each. And what you notice here is that each shati has a number associated with it. And these numbers are approximately the order in which these variations are listed in the canonical texts like Tabrizi's Al-Kafi fi al-aroud wal-qawafi. So if you look at this, you see that Tawil 1. So if you start composing according to Tawil 1, your entire poem has to be Tawil 1. If you start composing, if we move down Basit 2, then your entire poem has to be Basit 2, etc. So you can only choose, when you decide to compose poetry, other than the Rajaz Muzdawaj, dual Rajaz, which we'll talk about inshallah, other than that, you choose one row in this chart and you stick to it for the entire poem. والشاطئ الذي يفتقد تفعيلة من بحره يسمى مجزوءا وما كملت تفعيلاته يسمى تاما. So there are just some general terminology. If there is so you'll notice that there are a number of feet and they're divided up with these diagonal slashes. And so if there is a foot missing in a particular kind of, or a particular variation of a meter, then that's called majzu. And if there is nothing missing, then it's called tam. So let's take another look at the chart. When we go back to the chart, we see Basit 1 has how many taf'ilat? It has 4. Basit 2 also has 4. So both of those are tam. Even though there's a variation between them, they're still tam. Whereas Basit 6, if you notice, only has 3 feet per hemistick. And so in that case, it's called majzu' al-basit. It's called, so this word majzu' or partial is used when a foot is missing. Now we're going to get to the juicy stuff. How is rajaz different from Sher? Well, it's different in 4 ways. ويختلف الرجز عن الشعر في 4 خصال. في الأبحر وفي توالي الحركات وفي التركيب وفي القافية. So rajaz differs from Sher in 4 ways. First of all, regarding the meters that can be used for it. Secondly, regarding how many consecutive short vowels you can have. Thirdly, in its composition or how you form a poem out of rajaz. And fourthly, in terms of its rhyme. So those are the 4 ways that rajaz differs from Sher. فأما الأبحر, as for the meters, فالرجز يغرف من بحر الرجز أو بحر السريع أو بحر المنسرح ويسمى الكل رجزا تسامحا. So as for rajaz, it can only be composed from one of 3 meters, from بحر الرجز or بحر السريع or بحر المنسرح. And all of these, tasamuhan, if you are not being exact in terms of your terminology, are called rajaz. So don't freak out when someone calls sari'a rajaz. It's quite common, but we are not going to do that in this class because we want to focus on what the actual metrical structure is. So tasamuhan, out of being lax, a lot of scholars and a lot of texts will refer to forms rajaz that's written in Sari'a, they will say that's Bahr al-Rajaz. And rajaz that's written in Munsarih, they'll say it's Bahr al-Rajaz. Whereas technically, it isn't. And so rajaz can only be composed of one of these 3 meters. وَالشِّعْرُ يُغْرَفُ مِنْ جَمِيعِ الْأَبْحُرِ. As for Sher, it can be composed from all of the abhur, all 16 of them. And if you include their variations, there's 63, but we're not going to cover all of them. We're just going to cover the more common ones, inshallah. So Sher, so the first difference between rajaz and Sher is that rajaz can only be from one of 3 written in one of 3 meters, whereas Sher can be written in any meter. That's difference number 1. ولا تتوالى 5 حركات في النظم. As for any type of poetry, whether it's Sher or rajaz, you can never have 5 short vowels right after each other. ولا 4 في الشعر. And in Sher, you cannot have 4 short vowels right after each other. خلافا للرجز. In rajaz, you can have 4 short vowels right after each other. So for both Sher and rajaz, you can never have 5 short vowels after each other. For rajaz, you can have 4 short vowels after each other, but you cannot have that in Sher. So in Sher, the maximum is 3 short vowels right after one another. So what is an example of what is not permissible in either Sher or rajaz? فَوَكَزَهُ. So if you look at it, فَوَكَزَهُ, you see that you have fa, wa, ka, za, hu. And so you have 5 harakat right after one another, which translates to 4 short syllables. Okay? So you cannot have 4 short syllables right after one another in either Sher or rajaz. So this word فَوَكَزَهُ could never appear in Sher or in rajaz. What is permissible in rajaz but not permissible in Sher would be something like فَشَرِبَت. So if you look at فَشَرِبَت, you have fa, sha, ri, bat. So what you have is you have 4 harakat right after one another, or 3 short syllables, in other words. So you can have 3 short syllables in rajaz. You can never have 3 short syllables in Sher. Rather, you can have a maximum of 2 short syllables, which translates the 2 short syllables translates to 3 harakat, 3 short harakat. So far, so good. Is that all clear? Okay. So the harakat are different than syllables. Okay. So if you have so let's go through this slowly again. So if we look at this word فَوَكَزَهُ, okay, فَوَكَزَهُ. So we have fa, that's a haraka. Wa is another haraka. Ka is another haraka. Za is another haraka. Hu is a haraka followed by a sakin. Okay, so what we have here is is 5 harakat or 4 short syllables. Okay, so that is not permissible in either sher or rajaz. Let's look at the next word, fasharibat. We have fa, 1 haraka, sha, 2nd haraka, ri, 3rd haraka, bat, 4th haraka. But they're only 3 short syllables. Okay, there are 4 harakas, but 3 short syllables, because the last one is a haraka plus a sakin. Okay, so the number is intentionally different. So if you read the Arabic books, they'll say one thing, or the traditional Arabic books, they'll say one thing, and if you read the Orientalist approach, it'll use syllables, whereas the Arabic books will use harakat. So I'm using both of them here. So what you cannot have in either Sher or Rajaz is 5 harakat. In other words, 4 short syllables. What you can have in the Rajaz, but not in Sher, is 3 short syllables or 4 harakat. Is that clear now? When composing Sher, you have to avoid 3 consecutive short values, even if the meter permits it. Why? Because there are some meters that overlap between Sher and Rajaz. As you know, you can compose Rajaz in Munsarih, you can compose Rajaz in Rajaz, you can compose Rajaz in Sariya. In other words, the meters Rajaz, Sariya, and Munsarih allow you to have 3 short syllables, one after another. However, if you are going to compose Sher in any one of those meters, then you have to use self-control and not use 3 consecutive short syllables. Let's take a look at the meter chart once again. So if we look at this meter chart, we scroll down and we find here Rajaz. So if you look at Rajaz, you see here that you have Rajaz number 1, you see here either short or long, followed by either short or long, followed by a short syllable. So in other words, if you want to write Sher, Sher with this meter, then you cannot use short, 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 long for any one of those feet, for any one of those taf'ilas, for any one of the taf'ilat. You cannot use short, 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 long. You can use short, long, short, long. You can use long, short, short, long. But you cannot use short, 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 long if it's Sher. If it's a Rajaz, you can go ahead and use short, 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 long. So that's an example of Rajaz. If we scroll down and we find a Sariya, we see a Sariya here, same thing. You see Sariya 1, short, short, short is possible. If you're writing Rajaz with Bahr al-Sariya, go ahead and do that if you want to. But if you're writing Sher with Bahr al-Sariya, you have to make one of those first 2 shorts a long, because you cannot have 3 consecutive short syllables. And similarly, when we scroll down to al-Munsarih, in this particular case, I included 2 different verses. The first one is Sher, and the second one is Rajaz. So wa baladin, wa ba la, wa ba la, short, short, short. That works because this is Rajaz written in Munsarih. It would not work if you tried to if you were attempting to write Sher. So far, so good. All happy? وأشهر أنواع الأراجيز ثلاثة. The most common forms of arajiz or of arjuzas, of poems that are written in Rajaz, are 3 types. Al-mashturu, which means halved. Al-manhuku, which means emaciated, like basically like starving or that has very little substance left because it's even shorter than a mashtur. A mashtur is halved. Al-mashturu wal-manhuku wal-muzdawaj, and the doubled or the dual type of urjuza. So we're going to go through every one of those types. So far, the differences between rajaz and sher that we've covered are the meters that are used, tawali al-harakat, consecutive short syllables. And now when we talk about the mashtur and the manhuk and the muzdawaj, we're going to talk about the two other differences, which is the form or the composition of it, and the rhyme pattern. فالمشطور, what is a قصيدة, what is a urjuza مشطورة? فالمشطور من الشاطئ الرابع من بحر الرجز أو الشاطئ السابع من بحر السريع. So it's either the mashtur is composed of either rajaz 4 or sari' 7. وَكُلُّهُ صُدُورٌ, and we'll take a look at them in a moment, inshallah. But what you'll notice about them is that they don't have any ajuz. They're just sadr. Okay? وَكُلُّهُ صُدُورٌ وَلَا عَجُزَ فِيهِ وَقَافِيَتُهُ مُوَحَّدَةٌ فِي كُلِّ شَطْرٍ. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So first, let's take a look at the meter, and then we'll pop back to this. So looking at the meter, what you notice is if we look at Sari' 7, you look at Sari' 7 here, and what you notice is that there's no ajuz. So if you so the mashtur means halved. So shatr is a half. So mashtur means halved. So what you do is you take this and you compose a half line and another half line and another half line, and they all have to rhyme with each other. So either you do that with Sari' 7, or you do that with rajaz 4, not with both in the same urjuza. So rajaz 4, similarly, it has no ajuz, it only has a sadr. So you take that half line, you compose a half line, another half line, another half line, and they can be even in odd numbers. They don't even have to be lined up like a qasida where you have each verse consists of 2 halves, because this doesn't consist of 2 halves, it consists only of halves. And so you can have an odd number of halves. I'll give you an example of that now, inshallah. مثاله من الشاطئ السابع من بحر السريع. لقد رأيت عجبا مذ أمسى عجائزا مثل السعالي 5 يأكلن ما في رحلهن همسا لا ترك الله لهن ضرسا ولا لقين الدهر إلا تعسى. So if you notice, you count these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You notice that there are 5 half verses. And so you're not obliged to make them an even number and arrange them on the page like you would with a regular qasida. Okay, so that's an example of an urjuza mashtura that's from Sari' 7. Now an example of an urjuza mashtura from rajaz 4. إن يلقني بحده المهلب أصبر وإلا لم يضرني المهرب شيخ بشيخ ذا وذا مجرب رمحاهما كلاهما مخضب. So here you have again you have rajaz 4 and you have half lines. They don't have to be an even number. In this case, they are. So any questions before we move on to the next type of rajaz? Okay, good. So what you notice here is we talked about the 2 other differences. The 2 other differences are, 1, the rhyme. So you notice that the rhyme here is different than Sher, because the rhyme in Sher is only at the second hemistick. But here there is no second hemistick. They're all halves. This is called rajaz. This is called rajaz mashtur, halved. So the second and or the third and fourth differences are here. The form is different in that it's not composed of two hemisticks, it's just all single hemisticks. And secondly, that the rhyme is between every half line. The rhyme is common among all hemisticks, not at the end of the second hemistick, because there isn't really even a concept of a second hemistick. Okay, moving on to the next type of urjuza. وأبيات المنهوك صدور افتقدت تفعيله. So the manhuk is basically a mashtur where you also lost a taf'ila. So you can say that it's basically mashtur majzu. So manhuk means mashtur majzu. Mashtur again means that half the line is missing. Majzu means a taf'ila is missing. So this is it's half a line, it's one hemistick, plus you removed from that hemistick one of the taf'ilas. So it's really short. وهي من الشاطئ الخامس من بحر الرجز أو الشاطئ الثالث أو الرابع من بحر المنسرح وقافيته موحدة في كل شطر. And so in this case, the same issue, the rhyme is common among every hemistick. It's just a shorter form. And so if we look at this, we'll take a look. We won't cover munsarih. We won't cover munsarih because even the chart doesn't cover the third and fourth variation because they're not that common. We'll just look at Rajaz 5. So if we look at this, if we look at Rajaz 5 here, so you see Rajaz 5 is the same as Rajaz 4, except that it has one foot missing. So as you can see, it's both mashtur and majzu. And when something is both mashtur and majzu, it makes it manhuk. So now looking at the example, so if we take a look at an example, he says كالبدر في إشراقه والبحر في إغداقه والأيم في إطراقه والريم في إرهاقه. So as you notice, these are they're all rhyming, and so we covered the other two differences between the Rajaz and Sher also for this type of urjuza, which is the structure, that it's not composed of a sadr and a ajuz, and also its rhyme in that it is the rhyme occurs with every shatr. Okay, going to take a look at questions before we proceed. Okay, I haven't fully understood what shatit means. It's a variation of the bahr, but why does al-madid have 1, 3, 5, and 6? What happened to 2 and 4? So the idea is that we're only listing the common variations here, and the order, the numbering and the order basically map out to what you'll find in a canonical text like Tabrizi's al-kafi fi ilm al-aroud wal-qawafi. So the less common forms are not included here. So does it have to rhyme? Are you referring to Rajaz here? So if you're referring to Rajaz, yes, it has to rhyme. The rhyme structure is at the end of every single shatr, at the end of every single hemistick. Okay, moving forward. Wal-muzdawaj. Now the muzdawaj is where it gets a little bit interesting. This is basically an Islamic era invention. Okay. Wal-muzdawaju yughrafu min ash-shati' ar-rabi'i من بحر الرجز مرتين في كل بيت أو من الشاطئ السابع من بحر السريع مرتين في كل بيت. If you are doing a dual urjuza, and most basically most manzumat ilmiya, most didactic poems, the poems that you read that teach you nahu, that teach you tajweed, that teach you logic, that all these Islamic didactic poems, they're basically all Rajaz Muzdawaj. The Shatibiyya in qira'at would be a clear counter example of that. That's in Bahr al-Tawil. But other than that, most of them are rajaz muzdawaj. So what do you do in rajaz muzdawaj? You take rajaz 4 and you double it. So rajaz 4 is normally only a half verse. You double it and you make that into one full verse. Or Sari'a 7, which is only a half verse, and you double it. And you can mix those two different types of verses in a single urjuza. You cannot mix Sari'a 7 and Rajaz 4 in a single verse, but you can mix Rajaz 4 and Sari'a 7 in a single urjuza muzdawaja. And so that's in terms of its structure. In terms of its rhyme, each verse's first hemistick rhymes with its second hemistick, but they don't have to rhyme with any other verse. So each verse has an independent rhyme where the first and second hemistick rhyme. So it's like you have Tasria there in every verse, but every verse is allowed to have a separate rhyme. So finishing reading the Metre, and then we'll go. We'll look at an example. ويجتمع البحران في أرجوزة مزدوجة واحدة. So both of these meters can be found in a single urjuza, in a single dual urjuza. ولكل بيت قافية في عروضه وضربه يستقل بها عن بقية أبيات الأرجوزة. And every verse has an independent rhyme that can be different from the rhymes of any other verses in that same urjuza. So let's take a look at an example. So this is from Tuhfat al-Atfal, a didactic poem on tajweed. So the author says, يقول راجي رحمة الغفور دوما سليمان هو الجمزوري الحمد لله مصليا على محمد وآله ومن تلا وبعد هذا النظم للمريد في النون والتنوين والمدود. So if you notice, the first verse is Sari'a 7. Confirm that, please. The second verse is Rajaz 4. The third verse is back to Sari'a 7. The first verse rhymes on a ra, Ghafuri, Jamzuri. The second verse rhymes on a lam, ala, tala. The third verse rhymes on a dal, muridi, mududi. So as you see in a single urjuza here, you're using both Sari'a 7, which you double for each verse, and Rajaz 4, which you double for each verse, but you don't mix them in the same verse, but you can mix them in the same urjuza. And each particular and each verse has its own independent rhyme. Okay. Any questions on that before we go forward? Doesn't taking half and doubling it just make it whole? Yes, indeed. Is it just to have an independent rhyme for each verse? Well, the thing is that the idea was that originally, before Islam, these only existed as half lines, as half verses. And so it was an Islamic era invention to double them. What does it mean by double? You take the Rajaz 4 or Sari'a 7 and you compose it twice and make that into one verse. Is Urjuza any Rajaz poem? Yes, that's correct. So far, so good? Okay, so that is the difference between Rajaz and Sher. Now, sometimes people get confused and they'll say, well, you know, this is Rajaz and it's not Sari'a. I think it's generally a waste of time to argue with people because they don't read Tabrizi. And so if you accept the general idea that there is tasamuh, there is some laxity allowed in terminology, and anything that you compose rajaz in can be called rajaz, then fine. But really, if you go down to the details, there's a difference between bahr al-rajaz and bahr al-sariya. In the urjuza muzdawaja, you can tell the difference immediately because the sariya has 11 syllables per hemistick, whereas rajaz has 12 syllables per hemistick. So if it has 11, you know that it's sariya, and if it has 12, you know that it's rajaz. What people will say, well, they'll say, well, you know, there is a variation of rajaz where it has 11 syllables. So what do you say about that? And so they're indistinguishable. Well, no, they're not indistinguishable if you read carefully, because rajaz only allows that in the darb, not in the ajuz, not in the sadr. And so if you go into the details, you'll find that there actually is a clear distinction between the two, but there's tasamuh, there's some laxity in terms of terminology. Okay, any questions before we go forward? Because we're going to go on onto a different topic right now. The doubling still won't be classed as Sher? Absolutely not. It's not classed as Sher. Okay, repeat what in particular? Okay, I'll wait until I stop next for you to write out the exact question because I can't remember what I just said. Okay, طيب, moving forward. طيب. التصريع. So what is tasria'? First of all, when can you do tasria'? Tasria' is essentially a rhyme on the first line of, for the first verse of a qasida, not of an urjuza, because in urjuza it has a separate rhyme structure. So tasria' only applies to Sher. ويكثر تصريع ويكثر تصريع مطلع القصيدة. So doing tasria' for the first verse in a poem is very common. Why? Because Sher is usually the verses are a bit long, and so when you rhyme on both hemisticks at the start, you basically set up the listener's ear to listen for that rhyme. Okay, so that's why it's a good idea to do tasria', but you don't have to. But what is tasria'? وهو تبديل تفعيلة العروض بتفعيلة الضرب وإلحاق القافية بالعروض. Okay, so tasria' consists of two parts. One part is that you look at the aroud, which is the last foot in the first hemistick, and you get rid of it, and in its place you put the taf'ila of the darb, and then you make them rhyme. So let's just take a look at this chart for a moment and see what's going on here. So if we go back up here and we look at Basit 1. So if you look at Basit 1, look at the sadr and look at the last hemistick in the sadr. The last hemistick in the sadr is short, short, long. And look at the last hemistick in the ajuz. The last hemistick in the ajuz is short, short, long. So we're going to get rid of this taf'ila here, the last taf'ila in the sadr, which is short, short, long, and we're going to put in its place another the taf'ila of the darb, which is also short, short, long. Well, that was pretty boring. Well, the reason why that's boring is because this is a symmetrical bahr. This is a symmetrical variation of basit. But there are asymmetrical variations. There are variations that are not mirror images of each other. Like what? Well, look at number 2. If you look at number 2, you see that in the sadr, the last taf'ila, the aroud, is short, short, long. Whereas in the ajuz, the last taf'ila, which is called the darb, is long, long. So when we're doing tasria', we're going to eliminate, so for the very first verse, when we're doing tasria', we're going to eliminate this short, short, long, and we're going to put in its place long, long. So let's take a look at this in practice. If we look at this verse, we're going to first start with Basit 2 that is not musarra, that doesn't have tasria'. So this is a verse from Banat Su'ad, and it's a verse from it's not the first verse, so there's no tasriya in this verse. So حتى وضعت يميني لا أنازعه في كف ذي نقمات قيله القيل. So the meter is written out. As you notice, the meter is almost symmetrical between the sadr and the ajuz, but not quite. The last taf'ila differs. So the last taf'ila, the aroud is short, short, long, and the darb is long, long. So when we want to do tasriya, what do we have to do? We have to get rid of the aroud and replace it with the form of the darb. So as you can see here, you have two different, the aroud and darb do not match in form. But when we want to do tasriya, they have to match. So what do we do? This is an example of the first line, or this is the first verse of Banat Su'ad. So it's an example of a bayt musarra. So what you see is that instead of short, short, long at the end of the sadr, we have long, long. So there are two things you have to do tasriya. First, replace the aroud, the form of the aroud, with the form of the darb. And second, make it rhyme. So as you can see here, بانت سعاد فقلبي اليوم متبول متيم إثرها لم يفت مكبول. So if you notice, we changed the form of the sadr, of the aroud in particular, to match the form of the darb. So if there are other changes in the hashr, we don't touch those. This is why the feet are important and the feet divisions are important. Because when you do tasriya, you have to replace the form of the aroud with the darb. Okay. If we're doing, this says asymmetrical meters once again. I'll fix the slide. Inshallah, it should say symmetrical. If they are symmetrical meters, if it's a symmetrical variation, like for example, ودع هريرة, one of the mu'allaqat. So this is basit 1. If you notice, in basit 1, there is no difference between the aroud and between the darb. So the only thing we have to do is just make it rhyme. And part of making it rhyme is doing ishba' of the last harakah. So you see, ودع هريرة, inshallah I'll fix that as well. ودع هريرة إن الركب مرتحل وهل تطيق وداعا أيها الرجل. So if you notice, there's nothing to fix in terms of the form of the aroud. So you just make it rhyme. And part of making it rhyme is doing ishba' of the harakah. Okay. So far so good? All clear? Let me read through these questions. In each taf'ila of rajaz, which is mustaf'ilun, why is it optional whether you choose short or long in place of mus or taf, which are both long? Because that's the way the ulama reverse engineered how Arabs used it. So if mustaf'ilun is giving you trouble, then ignore that, because the traditional method is confusing. Sorry. So it's just the form of the taf'ila. The syllables themselves don't have to match exactly. Well, if the taf'ila matches, then the syllables will match, unless there is a zihaf. A zihaf is where you have an option. Then in that case they don't have to, but in general they will for the when you're doing tasriya, because the whole point is for there to be a powerful rhyme, and the rhyme can only happen if they take the same syllable pattern. ودع هريرة is الأعشز معلقة. Oh, I see. Do the actual letters have to match? No. So كل متحرك, as we did in the first class, كل متحرك سواء وكل ساكن سواء. So it doesn't matter what actual letters are used. Al-Asha, yes, that's correct. This is ودع هريرة is Al-Asha's معلقة. Naam, okay, great. Why is it that they say there are 16 buhur with variations instead of just saying there are 63 forms? Isn't that easier? Historical reasons. Type. Moving forward. Now, we're going to discuss the poetic meters, inshallah. And basically, after we go over these poetic meters, we're going to go through this chart. You will know aroud, and all there's left to study is qafiyah, inshallah, and that's all there is to it. So this chart doesn't list every single variation. There are a lot of variations. It just lists the most common ones. So let's go through these, and we will. So we'll go through some basic ones, and then we'll talk about variable length meters and some other interesting tricks. Let me first check if there are any further questions before moving forward. Okay, type. So if we look at, for example, طويل 2. This is from the Mu'allaqa of Zuhair. طويل 2. So he says, ومن يك ذا فضل فيبخل بفضله على قومه يستغنى عنه ويذمم. So if we cut it up, we see, can you see the cursor when I'm moving it? Are you able to see the cursor? I'm not sure how this screen share works. Okay, great. So as you can see, wa, man, ya, ku, ذا, فض, لن, fa, yab, khal, bi, fad, li, he. You might say, wait, why are you doing ishba' of the ha? You said we can't do ishba' of the ha, or we can't do ishba' of the aroud unless there's tasria. You can always do ishba' of the ha, no matter what. That's allowed everywhere. Okay. Next half. A, la, qaw, mi, he, yus, tagh, na, an, hu, wa, yudh, ma, mi. Gets pretty boring pretty quickly. So you can go through a number of these. Let's take a look at something interesting. So the X is short. The horizontal line is a long. The X with a line underneath it is either one. Now, if you look at, let's go to look at an example of camel 2. Okay. So if we look at camel 2, we're not going to do that line. All these examples that I gave, they're pretty much all, inshallah, all the examples used in here are authoritative era examples from Asr al-Ihtijaj. I want to use an example that's not from Asr al-Ihtijaj here, from Suhrawardi, because there are two variations in the way that the poem has been narrated, and it demonstrates something interesting here. So Kamil, Wafir, and others, these are variable length abhur. These are meters that do not consist of a consistent number or a fixed number of syllables. Rather, they can change. The number of syllables can change. So these two X's with a line underneath them, what does that mean? That means either you have a choice. You can either put two shorts or one long. So not both, not one long and one short, either two shorts or one long. So if we look at this, let's first of all switch back to the slide. So there are two variations of this poem from Suhrawardi. He says, وَرَحْمَةَ لِلْعَاشِقِينَ تَحَمَّلُوا ثِقَلَ الْمَحَبَّةِ وَالْهَوَى فَضَّاحُوا. And another variation says, وَرَحْمَةَ لِلْعَاشِقِينَ تَحَمَّلُوا سِتْرَ الْمَحَبَّةِ وَالْهَوَى فَضَّاحُوا. So what's the difference in the pattern? The difference in the pattern here is thiqa is two shorts, whereas sit is one long. So we're going to apply this here and see how that works. So this is camel 2. So we see wa here. We're using a long here. Wa, rah, ma, ta, lil, a, shi, qi, na, ta, ham, ما لو ثي قا لل or sit رل ثي قا لل or sit رل ما حب ب تي وال ها و فض ضا حو. All clear? Before moving forward, let's make sure that's clear. So in Camel 2, the number of letters at the point of choice remains the same. I'm not sure that I understand the question, but I'll try to answer it anyway. So whenever you see the two X's with a line underneath them, whenever you see the two X's with the line underneath them, that means anywhere you see that, you have a choice to use two shorts or one long. Do you have to consistently choose the same thing? Absolutely not. Whenever you see the two X's with a line underneath them, two shorts or one long. So let's go through the second hemistick again. Thi, qa, lal. So first of all, the first two symbols, the XX and then with a line underneath it, and then the hyphen. Is that clear that that can be either thiqalal or sitral? Is that clear so far? Okay, so you can say sitral ma hab ba ti wal ha wa fad da hu. All good? Is that clear now? Okay, moving forward. So if we scroll down, you'll find some areas here, for example, if we look at Ramal 2, you see that Ramal 2 ends in a double long. So as you can see, أنه قد طال حبسي وانتظار. So that's a double long. And you see that Syria also ends in a double long. Syria 1 also ends in a double long. What else are some interesting anomalies here? Some other interesting anomalies include that mutaqarib 1, the brackets or the parentheses here means that you can totally omit that syllable. So at the end of mutaqarib, you can end the last taf'ila of mutaqarib can either of mutaqarib 1, pardon me. The last taf'ila of mutaqarib 1 can either be the last taf'ila of the aroud of mutaqarib 1 can either be short long, or can be one of short long, short long short, or short long long. If you put a short there, then when reciting it, you would connect the sadr with the ajuz, because you cannot stop on a short vowel in Arabic. What's within brackets is completely optional. All right, and that's basically all there is to it. So hopefully that's clearer than mud. And let's see. Let's finish this up. What's your homework? Your homework is compose a 3-verse qasida. So choose any meter. Although the most common meters are wafir, kamil, basit, and tawil. So those 4, about 80% of pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry is in those 4: basit, kamil, wafir, and tawil. So compose a 3-verse qasida. Tasria in the first verse is optional. That's your first bit of homework. And your second bit of homework is compose a 5-verse urjuza muzdawaja. Okay, any questions before we end today's session? What does the hyphen and underscore together mean in mutaqarib 2? So let's take a look at that. Mutaqarib 2. So what does the hyphen and underscore together? So hyphen and underscore. That's a double long. So wasa'al. So as you can see, that's a double long. Mutaharrik, which is the ayn, followed by a sakin, which is the alif, followed by another sakin, which is the lam. Qasida is a poem of Sher. Urjuza is a poem of Rajaz. Okay. Class was a bit technical. Yes, the material is not, there's not a lot of material. There's just depth. But the Telegram group is there for asking questions. What, Tayyib, can you explain what you mean by X having to be connected again? So, okay, so if we look at, let's take a look at this. So if we look at Mutaqarib 1. So Mutaqarib 1, the first hemistick can end in short, long, long, or short, long, short. If it ends in a short, in Arabic, you're not allowed to stop on a short vowel. So you have to read, when you're reciting, you have to read the first hemistick along with the hemistick, like in one breath, like they're connected. So far, so good? Okay, moving forward through the questions. Does that mean there's a choice between a long or a double long? No. There's a choice between a long and a short or not having it at all. Like you aren't allowed to stop correct. You're not allowed to stop. It's a deep bahr, indeed. Naam. Even if we are a bit beginner, can we make one qasida? Inshallah, sure. Look forward to it, bi'idhnillah. And so if you, it's like riding a bike or learning to speak, or it's just one of those skills that's really difficult at first. And then all of a sudden, one day, you find that you can actually do it. Beginner in sarf and nahu, you might have some trouble. Also, if you have a limited vocabulary, you might have some trouble. The guy asking the choice between long and double long was asking about the double underline in the darb of al-mutaqarib 2. I see. Okay, so no, in al-mutaqarib 2, in the darb, you have to stop with, the last syllable has to be a double long. Put up the homework slide again, please. Okay, will do. Is there a choice between long or double long at the end of Mutaqarib 2? No. Mutaqarib 2 must end in a double long. Where do you start? Okay, so let's discuss that in the Telegram group. Please join the Telegram group and we'll move forward from that. So what's the tip for beginners? Let's discuss that in the Telegram group because I think that a lot of different people will have different approaches. And so it's good to open up a discussion. I don't think that there's really a fixed answer. هذا وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله تعالى أعلم وأحكم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل. Just putting up the slide for homework. There you go. نعم.